Before I get into today's episode, I just need to say that it's an emotional subject for me because one of my family members is a victim in this story. And even though I never met him, I feel a special bond for reasons that I can never even begin to explain. But if you're like me in the spiritual sense, you just get it. I also need to say that back in March, I did a mini episode on the subject, but I kept feeling like I didn't do it justice. So I'm back today to go into deeper detail.
Mystery, murder, and magic, heroes, and Alice.
My great-great-uncle Thomas Rance Yarber. He was born just 2 days before Christmas in the year 1880. Now, I'm not sure if he was born in the Honeypath area of South Carolina, but I do know for a fact that he died there. And how he died is what I'm going to tell you about today. No one likes to talk about this tragedy that happened in our state's history, but the fact remains that it happened. As a matter of fact, I never knew any of this until I was working on my family's tree a few years ago, and a cousin of mine emailed me the information that he had come across. My grandfather and his siblings, who were nephews and nieces of great-great-uncle Thomas, had already passed away. So I couldn't go to them for information about it, and I don't recall them ever talking about it when they were all still alive. Even the cousin who emailed me the information passed away shortly after sending the email, so I couldn't, ask him more about it. But it was like it just got buried with that, with the family members for, whatever reason. I was like, why couldn't anybody talk about this? But later I did find out why they couldn't talk about it, or no one was supposed to talk about it. I've watched several documentaries that were made back in the 1980s, I believe, and everyone that was interviewed on those all said that it was a subject they weren't to talk about. It was like it was taboo. And the thing is, pretty much anyone who was alive when it happened have more than likely all passed away. So what I'm talking about is the massacre that happened in 1934. If you've been to Honeypath, you know that it looks like so many of the small towns that dot the map of the southeast. There's usually this shell of an old cotton mill surrounded by little houses that in the beginning were occupied by employees of the cotton mills. There's maybe a few mom and pop businesses, a gas station or two, tons of churches, but absolutely nothing there that would lead you to believe something sinister had taken place long ago. Back in those days, the cotton mills were the center of life. It was like the heartbeat of the town. And not just in the South. They brought new hope to poor families who were near or at poverty level. An entire family could go to work, even the young family members of the families, because they didn't have laws in those days that prohibited it. My grandmother quit school after the 6th grade so she could go to work in a mill, and this was quite common back in those days. And I've even seen pictures on Facebook from back in the early days of these industries with children that appeared to be as young as 5 years old tending to looms, and it was often said that they brought those little kids in because they could fit into tighter and probably more dangerous places than the grown-ups could. But conditions in those mills were horrendous. It was very hot inside with all the machines running, plus there was no cooling systems in place. And one thing I do want to say is they were loud. It was really loud. And most of the older people that I knew growing up were pretty much almost deaf because of the machinery. They had worked in it for so many years. It just ruined their hearing. Now the workers, they worked really long hours, sometimes more than 12 hours a day. So just imagine being in a hot, sweaty place, working away, and to make all of that worse, the salary was very low for those times. Now, they brought home, this is back in the 1930s, they averaged about $4 a week, sometimes more, like maybe $1 more. Oftentimes it was less though. So imagine, even though the cost of living was lower back then, trying to feed your family, pay bills, put clothes on everybody's back, and anything else that they might need along the way on $4 a week. Now, a point that I should make here is that back in those days, it was often one person who was the big man in town. In Honeypath, at this time, it was Mr. Dan Beecham. He was the mayor of the town, superintendent of the mill, municipal judge, and he held several other titles over the years. And something that I should mention about Mr. Beecham was that he didn't own the mill. He was basically the plant manager. And he wasn't rich either, but he exuded power, and people assumed that he was rich and powerful. He had come from the same places that his workers had came from. He was really just another just another employee, sorry about that, of the Hammett family who owned Shakola Mills. Now, Shakola is the mill that we're talking about in this. I don't think I've mentioned the name until now. And then enter a man named Olin D. Johnston. He became a populist member of the South Carolina House of Representatives, and he really stood up for his working class constituents. He used his position to host committee hearings that suggested strikes by textile workers as a final weapon of defense for the working conditions. Johnston would later become governor of South Carolina and a U.S. senator. Then the Great Depression hit, and with it, mill owners demanded longer hours and ordered increased output, but they didn't offer more pay. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected as president, and he offered mill employees some hope of relief from these wretched working conditions. He brought forth what he called the New Deal, and with it came the National Industrial Recovery Act. It established a national minimum wage, eliminated long hours, and gave workers the right to join unions. With that, employees thought they had just what they needed to take control of their working environment. Shakola's employees would listen to Roosevelt's fireside chats on the radio and were given hope. They actually wrote to the president, and they listed all their complaints about the mistreatment they were receiving at the hands of their employers, and they begged for help. A lot of them, they joined unions, and by 1934, around 180,000 workers had joined the United Textile Workers of America. And about half of those employed by Shakola had become union members. But there was a loophole to the legislation that gave the workers right to unionize. The board that managed the law was one supervised by the mill owners. And we already know their feelings on the entire thing. So this permitted the mill owners to become even more powerful. So not only did they carry on with their poor working conditions, they also bullied or fired workers who were openly supporting the unions. Now, protests officially began on September the 1st, 1934, which happened to be Labor Day. And within about a week's time, nearly 500,000 workers nationwide had walked off their jobs. In South Carolina alone, 43,000 workers had joined the protest. Mills pretty much came to a stop because there was nobody there to run the machines. Well, this angered Mr. Beecham, but his bosses who owned the mill spurred him to hang in there and really stick it to the workers because they believed their business was at stake. And if their business was at stake, that meant their money was at stake, right? They wanted Beecham to quickly take control of the situation and put a stop to it, and to do it by any means. Now, like I said earlier, Beecham wasn't only the mill superintendent. He also managed where his workers worked, played, and worshipped. When any of his workers had a problem, he stepped in. He even went so far as to dish out fines as the town's magistrate when an employee's liquor consumption went too far. He ruled with a big stick, so to speak. Sorry about that. Allergies are bad this morning. Now, I call that an abuse of power, but that's really just my opinion. Mill housing was something that he kept in his back pocket as a threat for those who didn't obey. Like most mill towns, they were these little row houses. It was like row after row of almost identical homes And we have those here in Whitmire. One of the houses I live in is an old mill house. But anyway, they were owned and rented out by Chicola. Well, they also supplied the electricity and heating to them. So this meant if you lost your job, you also lost the roof over your head. So Beecham used the threat of being evicted as a way of keeping his workers in line. And if they were fired, they were kicked out of their houses with barely any kind of notice. But now his threats were being ignored because they had unionized, and that meant the union was to protect them from losing their job. Now, since you knew the kind of man Beecham was, it wouldn't, or it shouldn't, surprise you about the events that unfolded on day 6 of the strikes. On September 6, 1934, around 5 a.m., between 200 and 300 people gathered outside Chicola Mills as part of the Great Strike called by the National Textile Workers Union at mills across the East Coast. Well, some of these had come from nearby Belton and was known as a flying squadron. Squadron! Gosh, I can't talk this morning. Now, there wasn't any airplanes involved, but what a flying squadron meant... Squadron! Why do I keep saying squadron? Squadron was... In this instant, it meant that it was a bunch of workers from other mills who were also picketing, but would join the protesters at another mill to help shut them down. So these people had came from Belton over to Honeypath, which, I mean, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump between the two towns. They came to help the Honeypath workers shut it down. Now, the National Guard had responded to larger mills to protect them during the protest, but the governor of South Carolina saw no reason for it at Chicola because nothing had happened yet. Beecham had reached out several times, and the governor kept telling him no, there was no need for it. So Beecham had to do something, and he did. He deputized 126 townspeople and mill workers and gave them shotguns, pistols, and rifles. All the men that he deputized were anti-union. He also mounted a World War I machine gun to the roof of the mill. And keep in mind, for what I'm about to tell you, none of the protesters were armed, just the people that he had deputized. Now, picker sticks were passed out of the mill windows by those on the inside to those protesting on the inside, out on the outside. Well, this caused a panic, and soon these random fistfights broke out. At 7:45 a.m., shots rang out. They tried to use the machine gun, but it jammed. And 3 minutes later, 7 men lay on the ground. 6 died at the scene, and 1 died at the hospital. 30 others, including women, were less severely wounded, but all were running away with their backs turned when they were shot. They were shot as they were retreating. Among the dead was my great-great-uncle Thomas. He was only 53 years old. That's only 4 years older than I am right now. And I've read from several sources about this massacre that if that machine gun hadn't malfunctioned like it did, the number of dead and wounded would probably have been way higher than what it was. But 7 dead and 30 injured is plenty, and it's really too many. There shouldn't have been any. This never should have happened. The wives and children rushed to the sides of their head, of their dead husbands and their fathers. Some of the bodies contained as many as 10 bullet holes. Why 10 bullets in a person that was running away? That just floors me, and it leaves me speechless. I can't even comprehend that. These people were killed for standing up for their rights. Along with my uncle, also killed was Claude Cannon, Lee Crawford, Ira Davis, E.M., like M as in Michael, Knight, Maxie Peterson, and C.L. Rucker. A memorial in Dogwood Park in Honeypath was erected many years later, and across the top of it, it says, "They died for the rights of the working man." But get this, the churches in Honeypath were all owned by the Mills, and they wouldn't allow any of the funerals to be held in them. But it's okay because all the people that showed up would have never fit in those churches anyway. So what they did was they had a big mass funeral in a field outside of town. People, including labor and religious leaders from all over the country, came to attend. It is said that over 10,000 people attended the funeral. And I do need to add here that those workers weren't buried in that field, only the funerals were held there. As a matter of fact, the owners of Shakola, like I said, they couldn't use the churches because they owned them, but the owners of Shakola, they never showed any remorse over any of this that happened. No one really knows who gave the order for the first shots. I have my opinion, but I'm not really wanting to share that because now that everyone involved has passed, there's no way to prove it. But I will say that it was widely believed that Dan Beecham was the man who gave the order to start shooting. Warrants were issued for 11 men. 3 of those were Honeypath policemen and 8 were non-strikers. All were charged with the murders of the 7 mill workers, but all were acquitted after the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Those 7 people that died on those grounds never got justice. Even after witness gave their account, no one was held responsible. A police officer by the name of E.T.K. was said to have shot my uncle with a pump shotgun. The witness also said that Uncle Thomas was running away with his hands up in the air when he was shot in the back. Sorry. 2 of the witnesses said that Mr. Beecham was among those firing weapons during the massacre. However, Beecham said that he was standing in the door of the mill office the entire time, basically saying he had nothing to do with it. Now, if anything good could come out of this, it did. I mean, I like to think because of what I'm about to tell you, they didn't exactly die in vain. Labor laws were reevaluated and needed reforms were put into place because of what happened at Shakola. So maybe these 7 people didn't totally die for nothing. Now, if you know me, you know that I have to go and feel places where such things have taken place. And 6 years ago, I visited the site of the mill. I walked through it and around it. It probably wasn't safe to do it because it was crumbling, and some areas were just barely hanging on by a thread, so to speak. As I walked through the mill, I could hear the machinery running. It was much like the hum of the machinery at J.P. Stevens here in Whitmire that ran when I was a little kid. But that sound used to lull me to sleep every night when I was a kid. I could feel the frustration of working for nearly nothing and having nothing to show for it. And even though it was August and it was hot, I could still feel the heat coming from the looms and other machines. Yes, you may think that sounds ridiculous, but I treasure having such a gift. I really do. It helps me to understand the frustrations and turmoil that these mill workers went through. Due to a fire at that mill that took place back in April of this year, even more of that building has been destroyed. And sometime between the time I went there 6 years ago and between then and the fire that happened this past April, there was also an earthquake that took down a large portion of the mill. So there's not really much. It's like piles of red bricks. I've also visited the gravesite where my great-great-uncle Thomas was buried and found that his wife Leela, she died 4 days shy of 3 months before the massacre. So he had just became a widow when he was gunned down himself. On their headstone is engraved stamp that says UTW of A, organized November 19th, 1901. So it looks like great-great-uncle Thomas finally was recognized as a Union member. I do believe that his strength and determination of standing up for what he believed in carried on into my daughter Courtney. She will fight tooth and nail for what she truly believes in, and I'm proud of her for that. That girl is a firecracker. I shouldn't say girl, I guess she's a grown woman. She's a good mom. But yeah, she stands up for anybody that she feels being oppressed. She's got a good heart, and she's like her uncle, or that would be her great uncle Thomas. Now, if you'd like to learn more, there's a really good documentary called The Uprising of 34. I've been searching on it so I could tell, where you could stream it from, but I couldn't find anything. But there are bits and pieces of it, like scenes of it, on YouTube. So if you just search The Uprising of 34, you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. Now, if you're a reader, there's a book that I really recommend. It's called Milltown Murder. It was written by Dan Beecham's grandson, Frank. And I got my copy from Amazon, but it's available from other places too, I believe. I did see that Barnes & Noble has their Nook version of it. And I believe there was several other places. So, what happened to Dan Beecham? Because like I said, nobody was ever held accountable for these murders. Well, in the months that followed the massacre, his health started to deteriorate. And he passed away from heart failure in 1936. So that was just 2 years after the massacre. You kind of have to wonder if maybe his mental health was the big spiral that caused the rest of him to just physically go downhill after that. Because they said he died from heart failure. But I really feel like your mental health plays a big part of your physical health, I guess you could say. Well, that's all I have for today. I'll be sharing some of my personal pictures that I took of the meal and where great Uncle Thomas is buried. I'm going to share that on the Facebook page. Don't forget to come back Wednesday, because I'll have an all-new midweek meeting. And then don't forget Saturday, because that's when we do the Weekend Weird Files. And I'm going to have this week's weird news. All right, you guys have a good rest of your day. Have a good week. And I'll see y'all on Wednesday.